The painter had been in the house 11 days before anyone thought to ask his name, and Beatrice Alcott was the only one who did. She asked it plainly over the ruin of a dropped teacup in the drawing-room at Alderley, with the August heat pressing through the windows like a hand laid flat against the glass. She did not yet know what the asking would cost her, nor what it would buy, though she would remember the moment longest afterward, turned over and over like a coin worn smooth from handling. Had she known, she would have asked all the same. Cassandra Alcott, golden and certain of her own weather, had swept past the easel without a glance, remarking to their mother that the man wanted for manners as much as for family, and that it was a mercy artists were paid to be silent. The painter's brush had not paused. Only his jaw had tightened, once the way a gate tightens on its hinge before it is asked to bear a weight. Beatrice had knelt to gather the broken china, and looking up at him from the floor, plain in her grey wool, with ink still under one thumbnail, she had said the only kind thing spoken to him since his trunk had come up the drive. She had asked his name. He had told her it was Adam Vane, which was true the way a coat is true, cut to fit, worn on purpose and not his own. 6 weeks remained until Michaelmas, though Beatrice did not yet reckon the days by that name. Her mother did. Mrs. Honora Alcott counted them nightly against the ledger Mr. Josiah Thorne kept locked in the estate room, and against the wedding date already spoken of for Cassandra and Mr. Silas Price, a mill owner with more money than conversation, a date fixed for the last week of September, before the accounts must be shown to anyone with the right to ask hard questions of them. Beatrice knew the wedding was soon. She did not yet know why it had to be soon, only that her mother's smile had grown thin as good silver rubbed too often, and that Mr. Thorne visited more than an executor of a modest estate had any earthly reason to. She set the china pieces in her apron, and stood, and found the painter Vane, she made herself call him, though something about the name sat awkwardly on him, like a hat a size too small, watching her with an attention she was entirely unused to receiving. Nobody looked twice at the plain daughter of the house. It was Beatrice who had said that to him first, lightly, meaning it as a kindness to herself, before he could think it unkindly of her. "You need not trouble yourself to flatter me the way you must flatter my sister," she had told him on the second day, when he had asked would she sit as well. "Nobody looks twice at the plain one. You may look as long as you like." She had meant it as an old joke worn comfortable with use. She had not expected him to take her at her word, and look, and go on looking, in the particular way of a man cataloguing something he meant to keep. Mrs. Alcott, from the doorway, called that supper was laid, and the moment folded itself away like linen put back in a press, smoothed flat, waiting. The second sitting was arranged for the following morning in the little east parlour, where the light came in low and honest over the writing desk Beatrice had claimed as her own, since her father's death 3 years past. She arrived to find the painter already there, not sketching Cassandra as instructed, but studying the ledger book stacked at the desk's corner, with an interest no hired man had business showing in another family's arithmetic. "Those are not for sitting," she said, moving to close the topmost book with 2 fingers pressed flat against its cover, as if she might pin a column of figures down by main force before they could be misread. He looked up without guilt, which she found strange in itself. "I did not know a household kept its accounts in a young lady's own hand," he said. "Most families keep a steward for that unpleasantness. My father kept them," she said, "and taught me before he died, and no one else in this house has patience for a column that will not balance, so the habit has stayed with me the way a limp stays with a man long after the fall that caused it. He set down his charcoal. I paint what will hold still long enough to be seen truly, he said, as if it were a confession rather than a boast. Your sister holds still beautifully. You do not hold still at all. Beatrice found she did not know whether to be insulted or pleased, and said so, which surprised a short laugh out of him, quickly suppressed, as though laughter were a coin he did not care to spend carelessly. They struck their bargain there. Half in jest she would sit, since her mother wished a full set of likenesses for the album Lady Averil, meant to show discreetly among decent families with sons to settle, and he would answer her questions honestly in exchange, without the courtier's trick of answering a question with a compliment. It seemed a fair exchange. And cost, she thought, nothing at all. Mrs. Dabney, the housekeeper who had served the family since Beatrice was in short skirts, put her head round the door with the bluntness of 20 years' service behind her, and said she hoped Miss Beatrice did not mean to lose her heart to a hired man with paint under his nails, because hired men had a way of packing their trunks the moment the last canvas dried, and breaking nothing so much as promises they had never troubled to make. Beatrice told her she had no intention of losing anything at all, and Mrs. Dabney, wringing a dishcloth as though it had personally offended her, said that was what every girl said, right up until the packing began. It was Mrs. Dabney, in the same conversation, who first mentioned, sideways and half to herself, that Mr. Thorne had been closeted with the mistress 3 afternoons running, and that whatever passed between them left Mrs. Alcott looking as though she had swallowed a stone. Beatrice filed the remark away the way she filed every odd figure, without yet knowing what column it belonged in. Her father used to say a thing did not have to make sense the day you heard it. It only had to be remembered for the day it would. Mr. Josiah Thorne arrived on the Thursday in a good coat gone shiny at the elbows, and spoke, as he always did, in the gentlest voice in any room he entered, which Beatrice had noticed without naming why it unsettled her. He had been her late father's cousin by marriage, and was executor still, trusted with the estate's accounts until Cassandra or Beatrice married, and the trust could be discharged. And he wore that trust the way some men wear a borrowed coat comfortably, as if it had always been cut for them. He took Mrs. Alcott into the estate room and shut the door, and Beatrice, crossing the hall with a stack of linens, heard only fragments, the way one hears weather through a wall. My Kelmus will not wait upon a girl's fancies, she heard him say, softly. So softly that the words seemed almost kind. The wedding wants moving forward, not back, or there will be unpleasantness none of us can afford, least of all your daughters. She did not hear her mother's reply, only the small sound of a chair pushed back too quickly. Beatrice stood a moment longer than was proper, arms full of linen, and told herself it was nothing. The way she had been telling herself odd things were nothing since her father died, and left the house short of money and long on appearances to keep up. That evening, at the painter's 3rd sitting, she found herself watching his hands instead of his face, the way a woman raised on figures watches for what does not add. His hands were clean, unmarked by the calluses a working painter earned from years of scraping palettes and stretching canvas, and there was a pale, unweathered band of skin at the base of his left ring finger, where something had sat for years and been recently removed. She noticed also that a groom in the stable yard, seeing him cross toward the paddock that morning, had begun to say, "Your gar," before catching the word and swallowing it whole, turning it clumsily into "sir." Vane had laughed it off as the man's confusion with a wine merchant of similar bearing. Beatrice had let it go. The way one lets go of a thread one is not yet ready to pull, for pulling it might unravel something she had grown, against her better sense, fond of. That night the neighbourhood took up its own account of things, as neighbourhoods will. The Framptons, 2 miles off, wagered openly on whether Cassandra would secure price before Michaelmas, or whether the painter, plainly dressed, but strangely commanding, might yet turn some unmarried head himself, though no one seriously supposed it would be the plain sister's head that turned. Beatrice heard the gossip second-hand from Henrietta the dairymaid, who heard it from the Frampton scullery girl, and found she minded it less than she once would have. She had long since made her peace with being the daughter no one wagered on. What she had not made her peace with, not yet, was the small cold feeling that had settled under her ribs since Thorne's soft voice through the estate-room door. A feeling with no name, though her father would have called it, simply, a column that will not balance, is not hiding nothing. It is hiding something. Rain came the second week of August, close and warm, and kept the household indoors, and it was in that confinement that Beatrice and the painter fell into the easy habit of working side by side at the east parlour desk, he with his sketches, she with the accounts her mother could no longer bear to look at herself. He watched her tally a column of household expenses twice, swiftly, and set down the total without hesitation. "You do that the way a banker does it," he said, "not the way a young lady is meant to do anything." "My father did it that way," she said. He said a sum was a kind of honesty, since numbers could not flatter and would not lie, not on their own account at least. Someone has to hold them to their duty. He asked then why she had never been sent to London for a season of her own, and she told him plainly, without the self-pity she had long since trained out of her voice, that a plain girl with no dowry worth the calling was better used at home keeping the books than in a ballroom keeping a wall warm, and that she had made her peace with the arrangement years before he had ever set foot in the county. He did not offer her the pity she had braced for. Instead, he said, quietly, that he had not chosen this commission for the reasons her mother supposed, and that there was a piece of it he could not yet lay before her, though he meant to in time. Beatrice looked up from the ledger. "What piece?" she asked. He held her gaze a moment too long to be comfortable, and not quite long enough to answer. "Some debts," he said, "are better discharged all at once than in instalments that leave a body owing longer than it must." She might have pressed him further, but a letter arrived that same hour, brought in on a salver by the second footman, addressed in a careful clerk's hand to his Grace, care of Alderley, and the painter took it from the tray with a stillness so complete it was itself an admission, and told the footman, without meeting Beatrice's eye, that it was intended for his employer and had been misdirected. She said nothing. She had learned, keeping her father's books, that the wisest thing to do with a figure that would not reconcile was to mark it and move on, and come back to it later with a clearer head. That night she heard, for the first time, the painter laugh without checking himself, at something Mrs. Dabney had said about the vicar's new bonnet, a full, unguarded laugh that seemed to surprise him as much as it did the room. And Beatrice found she had been keeping a private tally of his laughter the way she kept every other account, and that this was the first entry worth recording. She did not yet understand what she was building toward. She only knew, setting down her pen that night, that the columns of her life had begun, very quietly, to refuse to balance, and that her father's old rule held as firmly as ever. It never meant nothing. It only ever meant she had not yet found what it was hiding. The blow, when it came, wore the shape of a kindness, which was Thorne's particular gift. He called Beatrice into the estate room one bright, unbearable morning, and told her, with real warmth in his soft voice, that he had long admired her head for figures, and that with the wedding preparations pressing upon her mother, he thought it only sensible that Beatrice take over the keeping of the estate's quarterly accounts entire, in her own hand under her own name, so that Mrs. Alcott might be spared the burden until after Michaelmas. Beatrice, who had wanted exactly this kind of trust her whole overlooked life, felt something in her chest lift before she noticed the trap folded neatly inside the gift. She would enter the figures. She would sign the figures. If a column failed to balance when the audit came, it would be her signature beneath it, not his. She said she would be glad to help, and heard her own voice come out steadier than she felt. That same afternoon, sorting through a drawer of old correspondence for a receipt Thorne wanted, she found, tucked beneath a false lining she had never noticed before, a small green account book in her father's hand. Its final entries stopped abruptly 3 years past, its figures running strange and private beside the public ledger she had always known. She had no time to study it before footsteps sounded in the passage, and she slid it beneath her shawl with a speed that frightened her, understanding only that she had found something she was not meant to find, and that finding it changed the shape of every figure she had signed that morning. That evening she went to the painter with the letter still unexplained between them, and asked him outright who he truly was, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. He set down his brush. "I am not only a painter," he said. "I had hoped to tell you the whole of it before you had to ask." "Then tell me now," she said. He opened his mouth to answer, and the sound of wheels on the gravel drive cut him off entire, Thorne's carriage returning early, and by the time the door had opened and closed below them, the moment for honesty had shut its door as firmly as the carriage had shut its own, and Beatrice was left holding a green book and an unanswered question, and beginning, for the first time, to be afraid of both. She did not sleep that night, turning the green book's pages by candlelight with the shawl pulled close, and what she read there frightened her more than the silence downstairs. Her father's private figures did not match the public ledger Thorne had shown her mother for 3 years running. Sums paid out to tenants appeared twice in one book, and not at all in the other, and a column marked simply J.T. grew steadily larger with each passing season, like a debt someone had been quietly feeding. She copied 3 lines onto a scrap of paper with hands that would not quite hold still, and hid the book inside her mattress ticking, and told no one, not even the painter, not yet, for she did not know which parts of him were true enough to trust with it. When Thorne offered her, 3 days later, a gentler road than the one she had chosen, she recognized the shape of the offer at once. He suggested, with real solicitude, that Beatrice's health seemed strained, that a season away at her aunt's in Bath might restore her before the wedding fuss grew worse, and that he would of course see her comfortably settled there. Her signature simply removed from the recent ledgers before she left, no need to trouble herself further with figures that plainly wearied her. It was, she understood, an exit bought at the cost of everything she had begun to piece together, dressed up as kindness. She told him she was not tired at all, and thanked him for his concern, and watched something behind his mild eyes go cold at her refusal, though his voice never once rose to meet it. He polished his spectacles on his handkerchief before he answered her, a small fussy gesture she had seen him make before bad news, and said only that he hoped she would not come to regret her stubbornness, in a tone gentle enough to be mistaken by anyone who had not learned to listen for what lay beneath gentleness, for actual concern. Beatrice went to bed that night, having refused comfort, safety, and her mother's certain gratitude, and having chosen instead a green book hidden in a mattress and a fear she could share with no one. And she told herself, pressing 2 fingers flat against her own knee to keep it from trembling, that her father would have called this the cost of honest arithmetic. It never balanced cheaply. It only ever balanced true. Within the week the accusation came, as she had known in her bones it eventually must, though not in the shape she had feared. Thorne told Mrs. Alcott, with visible reluctance, that certain sums appeared to be missing from the household accounts since Beatrice had taken them in hand, and that he hated more than anything to say so, but that a trustee's duty admitted no comfortable silences. Mrs. Alcott, white with the nearness of the wedding and the horror of scandal, did not ask her daughter for an explanation so much as she pleaded with her to make the trouble disappear quietly, and when Beatrice would not simply sign whatever paper was placed before her, her mother, weeping, confined her to the house until after Cassandra's wedding, for her own protection, she said, and the family's. On the same black afternoon, Beatrice learned that the painter's commission had been abruptly declared finished, his canvases paid, and his trunk sent ahead to the posting inn, arranged, she was certain, by Thorne's hand, though no one troubled to say so aloud. She found Vane in the stable-yard settling his account with the ostler, and asked him, plainly, whether he meant to leave without another word after all he had half told her. He looked at her a long moment, and said only that he had matters to settle that could not wait, and that he would come back for her if she would let him, though he could promise her nothing else that day. She told him, with more coldness than she felt, that promises from a man with no true name to give them were not worth the keeping, and watched something in his face take the blow without letting it show. The stillness of a man absorbing a wound he believed he had earned. He left within the hour. That night, alone in her locked room with the green book for company, Beatrice heard a soft knock, and found Mr. Sect, Pettifer, Thorne's own clerk, white-faced on the landing with a folded paper in his shaking hand, whispering that his conscience would not let him sleep another night under the weight of what he had been made to write, and that he dared not say more within these walls. He pressed the paper into her hand, and fled before she could ask him a single question, and Beatrice stood alone in the dark, with her father's book in one hand, and a clerk's trembling confession in the other, and did not yet know whether she held enough proof to save her family, or only enough to be believed guilty of gathering it. She did not waste the night in weeping, though she allowed herself briefly the small mercy of it. By morning she had read Pettifer's paper through twice, a cramped, guilty accounting of entries made at Thorne's dictation over 3 years, matching almost line for line the discrepancies in her father's private book, and she understood that she held, between the 2 documents, the whole shape of the theft, if only someone with the standing to be believed would look at it in the light. Mrs. Dabney, who had never in 20 years' service been fooled by a locked door, let herself in with the excuse of fresh linen, and found Beatrice already dressed and steady, and when Beatrice asked her, without preamble, whether she could get a letter out of the house unseen, the older woman did not hesitate. She had buried 2 husbands, and outlived a worse master than Thorne, she said, wringing her apron once for emphasis, and she was not about to let a good girl be shut up over a scoundrel's arithmetic. The letter went by the baker's cart before noon, addressed to Sir Reginald Voss, the county's magistrate, and, by the terms of her father's will, the estate's second trustee, a man Thorn had quietly avoided consulting for 3 years running. Voss's reply came within 2 days. He would attend the house himself, under cover of paying a wedding call, on the Friday before the ceremony was to take place, and would bring with him whatever authority the law allowed. Beatrice, meanwhile, found she could not stop thinking of the painter, of the stillness with which he had taken her coldness in the stable yard, and wondered whether the letters she had begun, in her head, to compose to him would ever be sent, or whether pride would keep them both silent past the point of usefulness. She need not have wondered long. On the Thursday evening, as the household made its last uneasy preparations for a wedding no one but Thorn seemed eager for, a plain travelling coach came up the drive without ceremony, and out of it stepped not Adam Vane the painter, but a tall grave man in a duke's own dark blue coat, whom the butler, without being told, addressed at once and correctly as Your Grace, and who crossed the hall directly to where Beatrice stood with ink still on her fingers, and said, quietly, that he had come back for her after all, as he had promised, and that he had brought with him a letter from his own solicitor confirming who he truly was, should she require proof before she would speak to him again. Thorn, coming into the hall behind him, and seeing a duke where he had dismissed a painter, went the colour of old paper, and polished his spectacles twice before he found his voice at all. The tribunal that followed was arranged for the Friday morning in the estate room itself, at Sir Reginald Voss's quiet insistence, with the family assembled and Mr. Price sent for, and Thorn seated where he could not easily reach the door. We will do this in the middle of the room, in the light, before witnesses who can carry it further than whispers ever could, Voss said, laying both ledgers side by side upon the desk, the public book and the small green one, and asking Beatrice to read the disputed column aloud herself, since it was, after all, her father's hand, and her own careful copying that had brought them to this table. She read the figures plainly, without flourish, and set beside them Pettifer's own confession, and Pettifer, summoned to stand before the room he had betrayed, and the room he had finally chosen to save, was asked only one question by the Duke, gently put, whose hand had guided his pen on every false entry. Pettifer's composure broke entirely at that, and he answered through tears that it had always been Mr. Thorn's hand behind his own, dictated word for word, and that he had hated every entry, and made every one regardless, out of a debt of his own Thorn, had held over him like a rope. Thorn, cornered at last, did not rage. He sat very still, and said, in a voice gone thin, and unguarded for the first time anyone in that room had heard it, that he had begun small, years ago, borrowing against the estate to cover a ruinous debt his own dying father had left him, ashamed to confess a second family failure so soon after the first, and that shame, once entered in a ledger, had proven a debt that only grew with compounding. It did not excuse him. It explained him, and the room, hearing it, felt something harden into pity where fury had stood a moment before. Sir Reginald pronounced no charge that would see him gaoled, and the family's name dragged through it beside him. Instead, he was to surrender every claim upon the estate, live out his years on a small allowance at a distant cousin's house, and never again hold pen to another family's accounts. Mercy reasoned aloud as protection of the innocent rather than kindness to the guilty. Missy, Price, hearing at last how his wedding date had been forced upon a girl who did not love him to cover another man's theft, rose from his chair and released Cassandra from the engagement then and there, with more grace than anyone had credited him for, saying only that a man ought not to buy a wife the way he bought wool, by the bolt and on a deadline. Cassandra wept, more from relief than grief, and Beatrice found, watching her sister's shoulders finally loosen, that she felt no triumph at all in any of it, only the quiet, bone-deep relief of a column that had, after 3 years, finally balanced true. It was later that same evening, with the house emptied of magistrates and clerks, and the last of Thorn's soft voice gone from it for good, that the Duke found Beatrice in the garden, where the light was failing gold over the hedgerows, and told her, without a single word about ledgers or debts or rescues, that he loved her, and that he had loved her since the first afternoon she had knelt on the floor among broken china and asked a hired man his name, when no one else in the house had thought him worth the asking. "Marry me because you wish it," he said. "It is the only reason I will take, and I have brought no settlement and no scheme to persuade you otherwise, only myself, which is a poorer offering than a duke usually makes, and the truest one I have." Beatrice, who had spent her whole plain life being looked past, told him that nobody looked twice at the plain one, and that he might look as long as he liked. And he answered, low, that he intended to look at her for the whole of his life, if she would let him look as long as he liked, and a robin that had nested in the hedge since June sang once, unbothered by any of it, the way the world always went on singing through the largest moments of a person's life. They were married quietly that autumn, in the small stone church above the village, with no crowd and no spectacle to match the one the Ledgers had made. Beatrice in a gown dyed the soft green of her father's old book, and Mrs. Dabney wept through the entire ceremony and denied it fiercely afterward over cake. Cassandra, freed from a bargain never truly hers, found in the following spring a quieter happiness with a curate's second son, who admired her wit more than her fortune, of which she now had rather less. Mr. Price, dignified in his release, married within the year a widow of good sense who valued his steadiness for exactly what it was worth, and counted himself the better for the delay. Pettifer was given a clerk's place in the Duke's own London house, where honesty was required and rewarded rather than extracted under threat. Thorn, in his distant cousin's quiet rooms, was said to have taken up, of all things, the keeping of a small garden, and to speak of his old life rarely, and always with his spectacles clean. A year on almost to the week, a young painter arrived at Elderlay's door, to take likenesses of the new Duchess and her mother, and it was Beatrice, not Cassandra, who crossed the hall first to ask his name, laughing to remember how a green girl with ink-stained fingers had once done the very same for a man in borrowed clothes, and she caught her husband's eye across the room, and found him already watching her, the way he had watched her from the very first sitting, as though she were the only likeness worth holding still to keep. If this story warmed you, if you have ever been the one nobody thought worth a second look, come sit by the fire a while longer with me, for the kettle is on, and there is a chair kept warm on purpose. Tell me, in the comments below, which line you would have spoken back, standing where Beatrice stood, and stay close by subscribing, so there is always a place kept for you here at the hearth. Sleep well tonight, and look twice at the ones the world too easily overlooks. You may be surprised how long they are worth looking at.